The mountains had always been his sanctuary. Far from the bustle of the city and the never-ending lists of responsibilities, the cabin stood as a quiet outpost against the noise of the world. For Major General William Harrington, now retired, the place was more than a wooden structure nestled among tall pines. It was a reminder that he had earned his peace. The mornings were his favorite. He would rise just as the mist still clung to the treetops, brew a strong cup of coffee, and sit on the porch where the silence was broken only by birdsong and the faint rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. Sometimes he fished at the small lake down the trail. Other times he read history books by the fireplace. Years of leading men and making difficult decisions had left him with little need for grand entertainment. Peace, to him, was a luxury more valuable than any medal. It wasn't that he disliked people. On the contrary, William had spent decades surrounded by them, mentoring, guiding, and carrying the weight of responsibility. But retirement gave him the choice of solitude, and the cabin provided it in abundance. He knew a handful of neighbors lived down the mountain road, but they mostly kept to themselves. It was an unspoken agreement. Everyone came to these woods for quiet, and quiet was respected. At least that's what he thought. The first sign of trouble came one sunny afternoon when William was repairing the railing on his porch. He heard the crunch of gravel and looked up to see a woman in a bright visor and floral blouse marching toward him, clipboard in hand. She moved with the determination of someone who believed she had authority over every square inch of the world she stepped on. "Excuse me," she called, waving the clipboard as though it were a badge. "You can't have that railing painted that color. It's not on the approved list." William paused, brush still in hand. "I beg your pardon." She stopped at the edge of his porch, peering at him as if sizing up a rule breaker. "I'm Coincidental Wilson, president of the Cedar Valley Homeowners Association. According to our guidelines, exterior colors must be natural wood tones, nothing dark. That shade of brown is not approved." He looked at the railing, then at her, and then back at his railing again. "Ma'am, this cabin isn't part of your association." Coincidental sniffed, unimpressed. "All properties on this road fall under Cedar Valley's jurisdiction." William set down his brush and leaned against the post with quiet patience. "My land was purchased long before Cedar Valley was developed. It's not part of your subdivision. That means your rules don't apply here." Her lips tightened. "That's not possible. I have the maps. I know the boundaries. You'll need to repaint that, and I'll also need you to register your cabin properly with the board." William kept his tone even, though inwardly he felt the old steel of command rising. "I assure you my cabin isn't under your HOA, and as for repainting, this color suits me just fine." Coincidental bristled, her grip on the clipboard tightening. "I see how it is. Some people think they're above the rules. That won't last long. We have procedures, you know, and I have friends in the county." He offered her a polite nod, unwilling to let her rattle him. "Good day, Mrs. Wilson." She stood there another moment, glaring, before finally spinning on her heel and marching back down the gravel drive. The sound of her footsteps faded, replaced again by the soft sigh of wind through the trees. William picked up his brush and continued painting, though the moment of peace was gone. He had met people like her before, people who mistook control for strength. Years ago, he might have faced down enemy commanders, but this was something entirely different. Still, he knew one thing for certain: Coincidental Wilson would be back. As evening settled, William sat on his porch again, watching the sky turn pink and gold. He thought about the life he had lived, the men he had led, and the battles he had seen. Compared to all of that, a determined homeowner with a clipboard hardly seemed worth concern. But in the quiet of the mountains, even small storms could stir big trouble. And as he sipped his coffee, William couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful retreat was about to become anything but peaceful. The next few days passed without incident, though William remained aware of the earlier encounter. Years in the military had taught him to read people quickly, and his instincts told him Coincidental Wilson was not the kind to simply give up. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who thrived on rules, and when rules did not exist, she made them. It was early Saturday morning when her figure appeared again, striding up the gravel road with the same sharp clip of footsteps. This time, she had a different weapon in hand, a thick binder filled with papers, its plastic sleeves shining in the sunlight. William, seated on his porch with a book in hand, set it down and watched her approach. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," he said evenly. "Not a good morning for me," she replied, her tone already sharp. "I looked through our records and guess what I discovered? There is no registered compliance form for your cabin, Not one. That's a violation. William raised a brow. As I told you before, my cabin is not part of Cedar Valley. Karen slapped the binder against her side. Everything on this road falls under Cedar Valley jurisdiction. That includes your property. According to Section 12, all homeowners are required to submit a compliance form listing exterior colors, acceptable landscaping, and proof of maintained fencing. You, sir, have failed to do so. He studied her for a moment, then let out a slow breath. Mrs. Wilson, my deed is older than your subdivision. It is not under your association. I've checked that fact more times than I care to count. What you're demanding has no bearing on me. She pursed her lips, clearly unsatisfied. You can claim whatever you like, but I will not let one property ruin the harmony of our community. Rules exist for a reason. William leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. His calm was unshaken, though he sensed the tension building like pressure in a sealed room. Sometimes rules exist because people fear disorder, he said, but order isn't always the same thing as control. Karen's eyes narrowed. I'll have you know, I was elected unanimously to lead Cedar Valley. People trust me to keep this neighborhood respectable. If you refuse to cooperate, I will file formal complaints. Do what you must, William replied, his voice steady, but I am not beholden to your board. Karen huffed, snapping the binder shut with a loud clap. We'll see about that. She turned and marched back down the road, leaving a faint trail of dust in her wake. William watched her go, shaking his head lightly. He had faced worse confrontations in far more dangerous places, yet something about her persistence reminded him of the kind of bureaucracy he had never admired, unyielding, blind to reason, and convinced of its own authority. That evening, as the sun dipped low, William noticed the flash of a camera through the trees. He set down his dinner plate and stepped outside. Sure enough, Karen stood at the edge of his property line, phone raised, snapping pictures of his cabin from different angles. Evening, Mrs. Wilson, he called, his tone courteous but edged with warning. She lowered her phone briefly. Documenting evidence, she said crisply. The board needs proof of noncompliance. William's eyes hardened, though his posture remained calm. You're standing on my property line. I suggest you take care where you step. Karen sniffed, clearly unshaken, and took 2 more photos before retreating back down the road. Later that night, William made a note in his journal, just as he had done throughout his career. Precise details, time, and date. Old habits never died, and documentation had often been the difference between confusion and clarity in the field. He suspected he might need a clear record of Karen's intrusions sooner rather than later. By Sunday afternoon, her efforts had escalated further. A letter arrived, slipped under his cabin door. Typed neatly and signed in bold ink, it declared that he had 72 hours to comply with Cedar Valley Association guidelines or face fines. The paper carried no legal weight, of course, but it was the principle of the intrusion that irked him. William sat at his desk, studying the letter. For years, he had faced foreign generals across negotiating tables, men who had entire armies at their backs. Karen Wilson, armed only with a binder and stubbornness, hardly seemed formidable in comparison. And yet her persistence carried the potential to disrupt the one thing he valued most: peace. He folded the letter and placed it in the same journal where he had recorded the photographs. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He would not respond with anger. He had learned long ago that anger gave power to those who sought control. Instead, he would wait, patient as stone. But deep inside, he knew this was just the beginning. Karen would not stop until she believed she had won. And William Harrington had never been the kind of man to surrender. The week that followed confirmed what William already knew in his gut. Karen Wilson was not going away. It began with the sound of footsteps early one morning. William looked out his window to see Karen standing at the edge of his drive again, this time holding her phone like a weapon. She snapped several photos of his porch railing, then turned her camera toward his generator, which hummed steadily as it powered the cabin. Her lips moved as if rehearsing a speech to an unseen audience. Later that afternoon, when he drove into town for supplies, William noticed the curious stares of neighbors he barely knew. A pair of men paused their conversation as he walked past, and a woman at the general store gave him a sympathetic smile before quickly looking away. Rumors traveled faster than wildfire in mountain communities, and he had no doubt Karen was the one lighting the matches. When he returned to his cabin, a paper was taped to his door. It bore the Cedar Valley Association's logo at the top, an oak tree inside a neat circle, and declared him non-compliant for failing to adhere to community quiet hours. The supposed violation? Running industrial machinery after sunset. William chuckled softly as he peeled the paper from the door. His industrial machinery was nothing more than a portable generator used sparingly to keep his fridge cold and lights running. Still, the warning made one thing clear. Karen was not content to harass him personally. She intended to build a paper trail. The following evening, she tried again. William had just settled with a book on the porch when Karen marched up the gravel road once more, her phone already recording. "Noise levels are unacceptable," she declared, gesturing toward the faint hum of the generator. "Several residents have complained." "Several?" William asked, keeping his voice calm. Karen hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, more than one." "I see," William said, leaning back in his chair. "And have these residents filed complaints in writing?" Karen blinked. "Well, not yet, but I've taken statements." "In other words," William replied, "you've spoken with them, but you have no official complaints, just your word." Her mouth tightened, but she pressed on. "The rules are clear. No disruptive equipment after 9 p.m. This is your final warning before fines are issued." William's gaze hardened, though his tone never lost its steadiness. "Mrs. Wilson, your rules do not extend to this cabin. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the county property records. It will save you the trouble of writing letters that hold no weight." Karen's cheeks flushed, whether from anger or embarrassment he could not tell. She turned abruptly and marched away, muttering something about calling the sheriff. That night, as the forest settled into stillness, William sat at his desk and opened his journal. He wrote down every detail, the time, the words exchanged, the claim of multiple residents. He knew from experience that battles were not won by force alone, but by preparation. Paper trails could be just as powerful as armies. 3 days later, her pressure took a new form. A delivery truck stopped at his drive, the driver carrying a large envelope. Inside was a formal notice of fines, typed neatly on Cedar Valley letterhead, complete with an itemized list: unauthorized railing color, noise violation, and failure to register with Association Board. The total, $1,000, payable within 30 days. William stared at the paper for a long moment, then set it aside. He had commanded divisions, negotiated with leaders across the globe, and carried the weight of lives in his hands. To think that his greatest disturbance in retirement came in the form of an inflated fine typed on cheap printer paper amused him more than it angered him. Still, he understood what Karen was attempting. She was trying to create pressure, constant, petty, and exhausting pressure, so that he would yield simply to make the problem go away. It was a tactic he had seen before in different uniforms and different languages. And it never worked on him then. It would not work on him now. That evening, he took a slow walk around his property, pausing at the boundary markers he had placed years ago. He made mental notes of the terrain, the angles from which Karen had taken her photographs, and the line she never seemed to notice she was crossing. His military mind, long trained to study landscapes for advantage, could not help but map every inch of his retreat. As the sun slipped below the trees, William returned to his porch, coffee in hand. Karen might believe she was wearing him down, but in truth she was only giving him time to prepare. For the first time in months, he felt the familiar stirrings of anticipation. The battle was no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when. By the end of the month, the situation had shifted from nuisance to outright intrusion. Karen's footsteps became as common as the wind in the pines. She showed up at odd hours, snapping pictures of his porch, his tools, even his trash bins. At one point, William caught her measuring his fence with a tape measure, muttering numbers under her breath as if preparing an official report. For a man who had commanded entire bases, the harassment was almost laughable, yet there was a certain persistence to Karen's campaign that couldn't be ignored. She was building something, a narrative, a case, perhaps even a spectacle. William knew people like her thrived on attention and authority. If one tactic failed, they simply escalated to the next. The escalation came on a warm Friday afternoon. William was repairing the small dock that stretched onto the lake when he noticed Karen's car parked at the end of the road. She was standing outside with her phone pressed firmly to her ear, her voice raised and sharp enough to carry across the water. He couldn't make out every word, but he heard enough to piece it together. "Uncooperative, Refuses to comply, possible trespasser, may be dangerous. William closed his toolbox with deliberate calm, so this was her next move. That evening, as the forest dimmed into shades of blue, he prepared for what he suspected would come. He tidied the porch, stacked his tools neatly, and set a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. It wasn't nerves. He had faced enough real danger in his life to be long past fear. But he believed in readiness, and readiness was a habit that never left him. The following afternoon confirmed his suspicion. Around 4 o'clock, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a patrol car. Its headlights glinted briefly through the trees before it rolled to a stop near his cabin. Coincidental was there, of course, standing proudly beside the road as if she had summoned a cavalry. Her arms were crossed, her expression smug, and her phone once again recording. William remained on his porch, coffee in hand, every inch the picture of calm. He watched as the officer stepped out of the car, adjusting his hat and scanning the area with a practiced eye. There, Coincidental's voice rang out like a triumphant bell. "That's him, the one I told you about. He's been violating every rule in our book, refusing to cooperate, and I don't even think he belongs here legally. You need to remove him at once." The officer gave her a polite nod, though his attention quickly shifted to the man on the porch. His gaze lingered on William's posture, his steady calm, the way he carried himself without effort. Something flickered across the officer's face, recognition, though faint and uncertain. William set down his coffee and rose, meeting the officer halfway down the porch steps. His expression was calm, his voice level. "Afternoon, officer. Can I help you with something?" Coincidental stepped in quickly, waving her hands. "Don't listen to him. He'll try to confuse you. He thinks he's above the rules. He's running machinery at night, his property isn't registered, and I suspect he's some kind of squatter. Look at that paint color. It's not even approved." The officer raised a hand gently, signaling for her to pause. "Ma'am, I'll handle this. Please step back for a moment." Her face tightened, but she obeyed reluctantly, hovering close enough to listen in. The officer turned back to William. "Sir, we received a call about possible trespassing and noncompliance with local association regulations. I need to confirm your name and see some identification, if you don't mind." William's eyes held steady as he reached for his wallet. He handed over his ID without fuss. The officer studied it for a moment, then looked back at the man before him. Recognition dawned more clearly this time, sparking a change in his posture. Coincidental leaned forward eagerly. "Well, what did I tell you? Clearly he." The officer didn't let her finish. He closed the wallet, snapped to attention, and his right hand rose in a crisp, formal salute. "Major General Harrington, sir," he said, voice filled with respect. "It's an honor." Coincidental froze mid-sentence, the smugness draining from her face as if someone had pulled a lever. William inclined his head slightly, accepting the salute with quiet dignity. He did not gloat, nor did he speak. The silence was enough, the kind of silence that carried weight, leaving Coincidental standing on the road with her jaw slack. The moment had arrived, though William knew it was not yet the end. This was only the beginning of the unraveling. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the distant ripple of the lake and the chirp of cicadas in the trees. The patrol car sat idling by the road, headlights faint in the afternoon haze. Coincidental blinked rapidly, as if her eyes were deceiving her. "Excuse me," she finally sputtered. "What exactly are you doing?" The officer, still standing at attention, lowered his hand but kept his posture crisp. His eyes never left William. "Showing respect, ma'am. This man is Major General William Harrington. I served under him in Kandahar." The color drained from Coincidental's face. Her phone, still recording, wavered in her grip. That's not possible. He's just some stubborn old man refusing to follow the rules." William offered a calm nod, his tone as even as ever. "I told you before, Mrs. Wilson, my cabin is not part of your association. It seems your persistence has brought us here." The officer glanced at Coincidental briefly, his expression polite but firm. "Ma'am, I need to make something very clear. NHOA has no legal jurisdiction to enforce fines on properties outside its charter, and you have no authority to accuse someone of trespassing on their own land." Coincidental's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in her life, her certainty cracked. William folded his hands behind his back, a gesture so natural it seemed to pull the years of command back around him. He wasn't raising his voice, nor was he gloating. He simply stood, steady and unbothered, while Karen wilted in the weight of silence. The officer continued, his voice carrying with the confidence of someone who knew the law. I'd also advise against making false reports. Our department doesn't take kindly to wasted time. This is not a matter for police involvement, and from what I see here, there is no violation of county code. A small crowd had begun to gather further down the road, neighbors curious about the patrol car. They lingered at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves. Some had already heard fragments of Karen's complaints, but now they were watching the story unfold with their own eyes. Karen noticed them too. The eyes of the community, the very people she prided herself on leading, were on her now. And in their eyes, she was not the confident enforcer of order. She was a woman being corrected, exposed, and diminished. I only wanted to maintain standards, she said weakly, her tone far from the commanding one she usually carried. That's my responsibility. People rely on me. William regarded her evenly. Responsibility is not the same as control, a lesson worth remembering. The officer's gaze softened as he looked back at William. General, I never thought I'd cross paths with you again. You might not remember me, but you once visited our forward base. You spoke to us about holding steady under pressure. I'll never forget it. William's expression shifted, the faintest smile touching his lips. I spoke those words to many. I'm glad they stayed with you. The officer nodded, then tipped his hat respectfully. With your permission, sir, I'll file this matter as closed. You have it, William replied. Karen's face burned crimson as whispers rippled through the watching neighbors. She clutched her phone tighter, but the recording that had begun as evidence now served only as her own humiliation. She lowered it slowly, slipping it into her pocket. I see, she muttered. Perhaps I've been misinformed. Perhaps, William said simply. The officer returned to his car, offering one final nod to William before pulling away. The sound of the engine faded into the forest, leaving behind only the murmurs of the neighbors and the uncomfortable silence between William and Karen. She stood frozen for another moment, caught between pride and the sting of defeat. Then, with stiff movements, she turned and walked back down the road, avoiding the eyes of those who had witnessed everything. William returned to his porch, reclaimed his coffee, and sat once more. The lake shimmered in the fading light, as tranquil as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The balance of power had shifted, and Karen knew it. For the first time since their conflict began, William felt the scale tipping in his favor. In the days that followed the officer's visit, Cedar Valley buzzed with quiet chatter. Word spread quickly about what had happened at the cabin. Neighbors who once gave William curious glances now nodded respectfully as he passed. Some even offered brief greetings, small acknowledgments of a man who had endured harassment without once raising his voice. For Karen, however, the fallout was immediate and painful. The very people she prided herself on leading had witnessed her being silenced by a single salute. Her certainty had cracked, and behind closed doors, whispers questioned her leadership. But if Karen Wilson had one unshakable trait, it was her refusal to admit defeat. She doubled her efforts. Within a week, the Cedar Valley Board held an emergency meeting, called at Karen's insistence. She arrived armed with binders, letters, and a string of grievances, all aimed at the man in the cabin. She spoke of protecting neighborhood standards, of outsiders threatening harmony, and of the danger of setting a precedent. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, hesitant to challenge her directly, but others were less convinced. One asked quietly, "Are you sure his property is even under our jurisdiction?" Another muttered, "Didn't the officer say otherwise?" Karen's smile never faltered. "Officers don't know the details of our charter. They see badges and salutes and they get confused, but we, as the board, must hold firm." By the end of the meeting, she had managed to rally enough support to draft a formal letter, one announcing that Cedar Valley would pursue legal avenues to enforce compliance. It was a last attempt to reassert dominance, a declaration that the battle wasn't over. Meanwhile, William carried on with his life as though nothing had changed. He repaired his dock, stacked firewood, and enjoyed his quiet evenings with coffee and books. Outwardly, he seemed untouched by Karen's schemes, but in truth, he was preparing. At his desk, the journal grew thicker each day, detailed notes of every intrusion, every false claim, every letter and so-called violation. He clipped the official-looking fines to the pages, each one labeled carefully with dates and times. Years of commanding operations had taught him that the strongest position wasn't aggression, it was patience, reinforced by facts. He also made discreet calls to old acquaintances, men and women who had long since traded uniforms for civilian lives but still carried influence in quiet ways. He asked about property records, county lines, and the history of Cedar Valley's charter. Within days, he had certified documents in his hands, confirming what he already knew. His cabin had never and would never fall under the association's authority. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, William stood at the edge of his porch and studied the road. Corinne's car rolled slowly past, her eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of anger and unease. She had expected a reaction, some show of fear or frustration. Instead, he raised his coffee cup in a silent gesture of acknowledgement, a faint smile on his lips. The moment unsettled her more than any argument could have. That night, William sat by the fireplace, his journal open before him. He reviewed the pages, each entry a brick in the wall he was building. He didn't need to fight Corinne on her terms. When the time came, he would simply reveal the truth, and the weight of her own actions would collapse on her. Corinne, meanwhile, was making her own preparations. She drafted more letters, spoke louder at meetings, and promised the board that she would bring the outsider into line. She hinted at calling for a vote to fine him collectively, to show the neighborhood that no one was above their rules. Her pride demanded nothing less. By the week's end, it was clear a confrontation was inevitable. The board scheduled a public meeting at the clubhouse, where Corinne intended to present her case before everyone. To her, it would be the stage where she reclaimed her authority. To William, it would be the moment to end the conflict once and for all. He closed his journal, slid the folder of property documents beside it, and leaned back in his chair. The cabin was quiet, the fire crackling softly, the lake outside reflecting the stars. For the first time in weeks, a sense of finality settled over him. The battle was no longer coming, it was here. The Cedar Valley clubhouse had never been so crowded. Folding chairs filled the room, neighbors leaning forward with eager curiosity. The story of the man at the cabin had spread across the community, and tonight promised answers. At the front of the room, Corinne stood tall behind a wooden podium, her binder open and stacked with neatly arranged papers. She had the look of someone stepping onto a stage she believed was hers alone. William entered quietly, a folder tucked beneath his arm. He wore the same simple clothes he always did, sturdy boots, a plain shirt, and a jacket against the mountain chill. Yet his presence carried weight. Conversations dimmed as heads turned, and even without trying, he commanded the room. Corinne cleared her throat sharply. "We'll begin now. This meeting was called to address ongoing violations and disturbances caused by one property owner who has refused to comply with Cedar Valley's established standards. As president of this association, it is my duty to uphold order and ensure fairness for all." She gestured toward William with a sweeping motion of her hand. "This individual has ignored multiple notices, defied our guidelines, and disrupted the harmony of our neighborhood. Tonight, we will vote on whether to impose collective fines and pursue legal enforcement." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few nodded along, but many looked uneasy. They had heard whispers of the officer's salute, of Corinne's failed attempt to bring the law down on the cabin owner. William stepped forward slowly, setting his folder on the podium when Corinne tried to block him with a glare. "I'll speak if I may." Corinne's smile was tight. "You've had plenty of opportunities to comply. This is a board meeting, not a debate." "Then consider this my final statement," William said calmly, his voice carrying across the room. "You've accused me of violating rules that do not apply. You've filed false complaints. You've even called the authorities under false pretenses. For the sake of clarity, I'll lay out the facts." He opened the folder, sliding several papers onto the podium. First, property records from the county clerk's office. This cabin was purchased long before Cedar Valley existed. It is not and has never been part of your association. Your charter has no reach over it. A man in the crowd leaned forward, squinting at the seal on the documents. "That looks official," he murmured, and several others nodded. Corinne's face paled. "Anyone can print a paper like that." William raised a hand, cutting her off without raising his voice. "Second, documentation of your actions. Photographs taken of my property without consent. Letters declaring fines you had no authority to issue. Reports claiming violations that never occurred. Every detail written down and logged." If necessary, I can present them to the sheriff's office and let them decide how to address repeated harassment. The murmurs grew louder now, shifting against Karen. Neighbors exchanged glances, some frowning openly in her direction. Karen's voice wavered, but she pressed on, desperate. He's twisting this. He's dangerous. The officer who came here, he was intimidated, that's all. William's gaze was steady, his tone unchanged. The officer recognized me. He saluted because we served together. He didn't do it out of fear, he did it out of respect. At those words, silence fell again. A silence thick with realization, the weight of truth pressing down on the room. Karen's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she flipped her binder shut. You're making me out to be the villain. I was only trying to keep standards. Standards, William interrupted gently, should never be an excuse for control. Respect is earned, not enforced. The crowd shifted visibly now. Several people began to applaud, quietly at first, then louder. One neighbor stood, clapping firmly, and others followed. The room filled with the sound, drowning out Karen's sputtered protests. Karen's face flushed crimson as she realized the tide had turned completely. The binder, once her shield, now looked like dead weight in her hands. She gathered her papers with stiff, jerky movements and stepped away from the podium, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. William closed his folder and tucked it under his arm once more. He didn't smile, nor did he gloat. He simply inclined his head to the room and stepped back, his dignity intact. The battle was over, and everyone knew who had won. The night after the meeting, Cedar Valley was unusually quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace, but the kind that followed a storm. Neighbors lingered on their porches, replaying the confrontation in their minds. Karen, once the unshakable voice of the association, had been forced to step down from her pedestal in front of everyone. And though no official announcement had been made, the shift in power was clear. William sat on his porch, the lake glimmering in the moonlight. His journal lay open beside him, though he hadn't written a word since the meeting. There was nothing left to add. The pages told the story, from Karen's first intrusion to her final unraveling. He took a long sip of coffee, letting the steam curl into the cool air. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to admit he'd been missing: peace. The following morning, Karen was noticeably absent from her usual patrol. Her car didn't circle the neighborhood, her clipboard didn't appear in driveways, and her voice didn't rise over trivial complaints. Rumor spread that she had been asked to step back from her role as president, at least temporarily. Some said she resigned in embarrassment, others whispered she had been quietly pushed aside. What was certain, however, was that Cedar Valley suddenly felt different. Neighbors who had kept their distance from William began approaching him cautiously, curious but respectful. A man from 2 streets over stopped by to offer fresh-baked bread, mumbling something about gratitude for standing up when no one else could. A young couple brought over a basket of apples from their tree, shyly thanking him for keeping his composure. Even those who said nothing offered nods or smiles as they passed his cabin, small gestures of acknowledgement. William accepted it all graciously, though he asked for nothing in return. He hadn't sought recognition or influence, only the simple right to live quietly without intrusion. Karen, meanwhile, became a shadow of her former self. She no longer lingered at the clubhouse or strutted down the street with her clipboard. When she was seen, it was only in passing, her chin tucked down, her steps hurried. The woman who once demanded absolute obedience now avoided eye contact, her authority eroded beyond repair. The cabin, however, was alive with quiet satisfaction. One crisp autumn evening, William lit a fire in the stone pit by the lake. The flames flickered warmly, their glow mirrored on the water. He sat in his chair, a blanket draped over his shoulders, and let the soft sounds of the forest wrap around him. Owls called in the distance, crickets hummed in the underbrush, and the water lapped gently at the shore. As he stared into the flames, his thoughts drifted to the officer who had arrived that day, the salute, the respect, the unspoken acknowledgement of years past. He hadn't asked for that recognition, yet it had come when he needed it most. It reminded him that the life he once lived, the battles fought, and the sacrifices made still carried meaning. Even in retirement, that respect remained. He reached for his journal one last time and wrote a final line beneath the many entries. The storm has passed. Peace remains. Closing the book, he set it on the table, no longer needing to document the days ahead. They would be his, quiet and uninterrupted. Over the following weeks, Cedar Valley settled into a new rhythm. Without Karen's constant demands, neighbors discovered that life was simpler, and happier without excessive rules. The Hoa meetings grew shorter, the atmosphere lighter. And though no one said it outright, everyone knew the turning point had come from the cabin by the lake. William never spoke of the confrontation again. When asked, he only smiled faintly and changed the subject. He wasn't a man who sought glory in victory. He was a man who cherished silence, who valued the crackle of a fire and the stillness of dawn more than any applause. And so, as winter drew near, William found himself exactly where he had always wanted to be. Alone, yet not lonely, respected yet unbothered, and free, finally, to enjoy the cabin life he had chosen. The lake shimmered under the fading sun, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. For William, it was not the end of a battle, it was the beginning of peace.